Thank you so much for that.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Steve.
I get $5 for saying your name right.
Your check will be in the mail. Welcome. Thank you so much for attending. This will be our first lecture, so please be kind. So who here has heard about the Ottosen case of 78? Few people? Few people.
I've heard of it.
You've heard of it. It has probably gotten a little bit of a mention in David Weatherly's book. That is probably the most I've ever heard mentioned of it, which is a shame, because this is probably a very crazy, interesting flap of sightings of Bigfoot here in Iowa. It is probably one of the highest reports in a concentrated area. And so it all started when I started digging into these reports back last spring, because I always heard the adage, Bigfoot has been seen in every state across the country. So of course, Iowa has to be one of them. So what's here in Iowa? Started digging into newspaper archives. I started finding a little bit of stuff in Ottumwa, some stuff in Sioux City. That's probably where the second highest amount of sightings were. The Lock Ridge Monster, that is kind of the poster child of Bigfoot in Iowa. But I kept seeing one small town mentioned over and over and over again, and that was Ottosen, Iowa.
And for those of you who have never been to or seen Ottosen before, it's just a small unincorporated farming community that was established in 1896. It was really an up-and-coming boom town until a fire came in and swept about half of it, and they never really recovered from that. At the time of the incidents, there was probably less than 100 people there, and a survey done in 2020, there's less than 40 people there today. So really, it's a blink and you'll miss it kind of town.
Yeah, for certain. So when going back into the reports, the earliest I found came back in '75 through the Gulf Coast Bigfoot Research Organization, where a man was on the phone with his friend going over the plans of what they were going to do the following night, and he heard a thud coming from the backyard. He went to go investigate, and that's where he saw this Bigfoot-like creature had grabbed a stray cat and carried it off into the forest near his house.
Another report on a family's farm, they found some very suspicious tracks out there. So they called in the sheriff to take a look. Now, he couldn't really do anything, no crime had been committed, but it was suspicious enough that they thought they should report this finding.
Yeah, for sure. And then the actual main flap of sightings began the following year. In July of '78, when little Donnette Hankins walked out of her grandmother's house to return home late in the evening, probably 11 o'clock at night, where she would see in the backyard this hairy ape-like creature lurking in the shadows with a pronounced brow, bright red eyes, and fangs as it was growling at the poor girl. Scared her senseless, and she went back into her grandmother's house for safety.
Now, just 3 days later, her sister Dawn would have a run-in with the creature. She was riding home late at night on her bike when she saw the creature step out from under a streetlight. She said its face was obscured by shadow, but she could see this big, broad, hairy figure, and she screamed so loud that her mother and a family friend had heard her. They came rushing to her aid as the creature ran off.
Yeah, but in the commotion, the mother actually did get a look at the creature, to which she described it as having a squarish ape-like face and dazzling eyes. And weirder yet, one thing that they described was hearing a disembodied male voice that none of them recognized asking, "Does anyone know what time it is?"
So just the day after these events, a rambunctious group of boys would have a run-in. They were playing at the edge of town in an abandoned sales barn. They had ended up chasing a cat up a tree. But one of them hears some ruckus being caused inside the barn.
Mm-hmm. And that's when one of the more rambunctious of the trio actually picked up a rock and threw it through the window of the abandoned building, stirring what was inside to rush out. And that's when the boys were rushed by the ape-like creature, and they took off on their bicycles. As they were getting away, one of them actually managed to look over his shoulder and see the creature duck into the cornfield.
Now, even though these boys knew they were causing mischief, they were scared enough that they went straight to the authorities and were just like, we saw something crazy.
And that's when we enter in Sheriff Marv Anderson. He was the sheriff of Humboldt County and kind of became the central person in these series of cases, because one thing was sure, he took every sighting seriously. He never passed judgment on the witnesses because he saw how deeply it affected each witness. So all he cared about was keeping peace in his little county and making sure he got to the bottom of all of this.
And like all cases of high strangeness, word of these events spread throughout the state. So then it was just a matter of time where sightseers and hunters came to the town thinking that they might bag an elusive trophy. Yep. So we have all these strangers coming into the town, clogging up the traffic, and the sheriff has to deal with this and this phenomenon of events. But he's literally sending out his deputies just to control the traffic that seems to come in.
One thing that I actually managed to do when I was like going through, I was trying to see how many witnesses were left from these batch of sightings. One person that I managed to actually track down was the writer Stephen Klaus, who worked for the Des Moines Register at the time and was the one covering all these cases. I talked to him a little bit about what he could recall, and he said, regardless of where townspeople stood, they really didn't appreciate a lot of the traffic coming to this town. Like, it really, like we said, it was a small, maybe a couple like blocks wide, so it really disrupted their way of life. And one person particularly he recalled was a pastor's wife, who was very irate over the fact that she couldn't even cross the street with the amount of elevated traffic that was going on.
Yeah, so regardless of whether the town believed that this creature was actually there, they all agreed that they did not like all these strangers coming into their town. And then next we
then
would
there were
have
like some pranks being pulled on the town.
So somebody had tacked on a Bigfoot County to the Welcome to Ottosen sign.
Yeah, and there was some schmuck hanging out in front of the post office that was wearing like a gorilla mask. Don't know what that was about. And then like that's when the Iowa Bigfoot Information Center got involved.
Yeah,
too,
so
right?
enters in Kevin Cook and Cliff LeBrec from Bigfoot.
The Bigfoot Information Center here in Iowa.
Yep.
Not
so
to
they
be
would,
confused with the Oregon Bigfoot Information Center.
and they would come and personally interview all the witnesses of this case.
Yeah, in fact, Kevin Cook felt that what was happening was genuine Bigfoot activity. He thought that it was like following the train tracks, because there was a train that bordered the town of Ottosen. And as they were getting to investigating, that's when things started to take a little bit of a grisly turn, as some of the people in town were actually, unfortunately, finding animals outside of their house mutilated, which seems to be another factor in high strangeness phenomena that happens, a la Mothman and the dog Bandit.
And then next enters our next flap of sightings.
Yeah, when in September, Anna Dodrill was wrapping up an evening of hosting. She had her brother over, and she was just doing the dishes, enjoying a good night. She actually was looking out the kitchen window, expecting to look into the serene Iowa night sky, when instead of seeing that peaceful imagery, she was looking into the burning red eyes of this ape creature that was staring back at her. Oh. A little bit of an elevated sound level. I guess I wasn't loud enough. Yeah, so she was frozen with fear. She didn't. What would you do when you're staring back at like one of these creatures staring right at you when you're just at your own home? Correct answer. Exactly. Well, what she ended up doing was she called the sheriff when she actually managed to gather herself. And when Marvin answered the phone on the other end of the line, he was actually hearing this thing screaming. It was that loud. Well, he tried to rush over there as fast as he could to see if he could catch this thing, but unfortunately, by the time he managed to get out there, the thing was long gone. It had disappeared into the cornfield yet again. But he wouldn't have to wait long for the next sighting to come, because 12 to 24 hours later, Robert Newell was getting ready for work when he would just look outside his window and see this hunchback, hairy creature come out of the cornfield and, like a curious animal, inspect like the farm equipment around. It was like looking inside the farm equipment. I think he said it was like the manure spreader. He thought it was looking for food. I don't know why it would find food in the manure spreader.
There was a couple more reports in this time. There was a trackway found near the river in West Bend.
Yeah, and then there was another farming family that was tending to their field. When one boy was sitting in the truck, he saw a pair of these creatures. So now there's two.
And then comes on the next big sighting.
The last one.
Yes. And this was just found south of Renwick, where about 40 students were making their homecoming float. One of the students looks off into the cornfield and sees two large shadowy figures, saying one having bright red eyes and the other having bright blue eyes. When they reported this to the sheriff, he said these kids, they were spooked. They would not go back out to the location that night.
Yeah, and it was at this point where Marv felt like he was going to be closing in on this creature. Because if we take note, this creature had been getting around and coming and going via the cornfields. That's how what it was using for cover. That's how it was hiding. So at this point, we're getting into October, so harvest season was setting in. So he knew once the corn was gone, he was going to find this thing. Well, he was right in the fact that the sightings ended with the harvest, because there were no more sightings past that point. But unfortunately, he never found this creature. The only last pin in this whole thing was he was called out to a truck stop. Somebody had told him, "We found the thing, it's in the truck stop." He comes out and he's met face to face with this statue, because apparently one of the ladies while out Christmas shopping, she found a department store that had put up a Bigfoot statue, probably to capitalize on these sightings. And she thought, let's raise the funds, let's buy this for Marv as a thank you for just taking this so seriously. And because he had gotten a lot of grief over doing so.
And probably gave the town some closure over this whole series of events.
Yeah, because like we said earlier, they kind of didn't like the traffic. They wanted to just move on and forget it. And that's kind of what they did, because this story became buried over time until 50 years later, we found this story and we started investigating.
So when we started our investigation, we wanted to check out all the locations of the reports and the sightings, one of which led us to the trail along the river of West Bend. Now, when I went to West Bend, some of you may know it's also the home of the Grotto of Redemption. So when I heard about this, it's a really unique spiritual location. It's made entirely of crystals and precious stones. I'm like, I think we need to do a little side quest. What I didn't realize is that it may have gave us a lead in the Ottosen investigation.
Yeah, because it was there that we ran into the groundskeeper, who actually gave us a tour of the place and gave us a little bit of a lore dump. He particularly had a fascination with us because he looked at me and he was like, "You look like Jesus." I kind of get that a lot.
So he told us a little bit of the history of the place, and that Father Dauberstein opened a zoo to fund the building of the grotto. Now, the zoo would have things like bears, large cats, monkeys. It made me think, since West Bend is so close to Ottosen, what are the chances that maybe an animal had gotten loose or was set loose after the zoo had closed? Figured it was at least worth checking out the reports of where these animals ended up afterwards. Well, the bears seem to have passed away at the zoo. They still have the pelt to this day, which actually is the only physical evidence of the zoo. So we weren't able to figure out even what kind of monkeys that they could have held. It really could have been anything from like a small capuchin to like a larger chimpanzee.
Yeah, and actually, we were able to cross-reference this with another case that we had heard about via another paranormal investigator. Actually, the guy that's from Newton outside here, this is one of his cases he investigated because he was called out to a farm along the Des Moines River, similar circumstances, where they were getting Bigfoot activity. They were hearing howls in the night, they were hearing knocks. They unfortunately were actually finding their chickens torn up. Almost fit the bill exactly of the Ottosen case. And so he went about investigating. He set up a trail camera and he did get something on footage, but it wasn't a Bigfoot. This guy had a chimpanzee loose on his property. Yeah, no idea how it got there. He contacted the Blank Park Zoo. He contacted the Ape Initiative. None of them were missing an animal. And he tried to see if they could come and pick it up. But unfortunately, they didn't have the spare manpower, so the winter set in, and unfortunately the animal succumbed to the elements.
So we had to consider that this zoo closed in the 50s. That left a 20-year span that this animal would have gone completely unnoticed and then resurfaced. Seeing that one chimpanzee couldn't survive a winter out here, what are the chances that one could have survived 20? So this possibility was probably highly unlikely. So what could it have been? Maybe like a hoax, big hoax be playing on this whole town, possibly?
Yeah, possibly, because this is actually what I thought was going on going into this, that this was going to end up being a hoax, especially given the fact that there was that guy referring earlier that was hanging out in front of the post office wearing a gorilla mask. Could that have just been a case of an opportunistic hoaxer kind of flaunting his trick that he was playing on the town? And this would actually, I would experience a moment of corroboration in this when I tracked down a Storm Lake Times article where they had sent one of their reporters down to the area where in West Bend at a bar they would run into a patron who said he knew the guy. He knew the guy that put on the gorilla suit. It was a local farm boy, about 17 at the time, who was just playing this as a joke on the town.
But the townspeople, they got a really good look at this creature. Like, they could describe features on the face. It makes me think, what are the chances somebody could get their hands on a high-quality ape suit? Enough to fool the whole town. So I think you'd be better than anyone to answer this question.
I think I might have something to say. If you guys can see at this slide behind us right now, and if you have stopped by our booth outside, I make monsters for a living. This is what I do. I work with film and television. I worked with musical artists when I'm not being silenced here. Uh-oh. There we go. I make monster masks. And also, on top of that, I'm from Iowa, rural Iowa. So I kind of almost fit the bill. Is this possible? Sure it is. But there's one detail here to take into account. The fact is, this was the late 70s when a lot of information on how to pull this stuff off wasn't readily available. It wasn't like they didn't have the internet back then, and the most that would be available is Dick Smith books, who all they would tell you is how to build like nose putty makeups on your face. The best that would have been available at the time would have been an off-the-shelf gorilla suit that was either rented or bought. Also, with my line of work, I work with a lot of private collectors who tell me oftentimes that they wanted to collect this stuff when they were kids, but they could never scrounge up the money to do so. So how did a 17-year-old scrounge up the money to do so? And then further going into the Storm Lake Times article, it further started falling apart when he was retelling the chain of events, because he said the hoaxer stopped doing this when the guns came out.
But that doesn't really make sense because the guns came up about halfway through all these reports.
Yep, and on top of that, There were some sightings, like the first one, where the creature itself was seen grabbing and dispatching animals. So that kind of takes it beyond a joke.
Yeah.
That's kind of borderline serial killer stuff.
So it wasn't
yeah.
a displaced animal, it wasn't a hoax.
What does that leave us with?
I mean, could it have been like an actual Bigfoot in Iowa? Well, I mean, quite possibly. If we look at just the Ottosen case alone, multiple people are having visual sightings of this creature. They're hearing calls that they can't place to any known animal. Even the sheriff heard it over the phone.
Mm-hmm.
And then we got the physical evidence. Multiple times, trackways were found in the fields, along the river.
Yeah, and then the behavior of the creature actually fits a lot of what we get with Sasquatch reports. Like, of course, the howls, common thing we hear them vocalizing. The thuds probably were like tree knocks. And the fact that it was seen bluff charging. That is like almost a hallmark of Bigfoot sightings when they don't want you in their area. And also what stirred on the bluff charge on the boys, I found particularly interesting.
He threw a rock at it.
Yeah, what is a common detail we see in Bigfoot sightings? Rock throwing. Could this have been a case where the animal had felt challenged and that initiated the bluff charge? That added to the credibility that this was a flesh and blood animal that we're dealing with.
Not only that, Sasquatch sightings are still reported in this state to this day. Although we don't think this is probably a permanent home to the hairy hominid, we think it may be more of a migratory path going from north to south and vice versa, possibly using the Des Moines River where many of these sightings are reported.
Yeah, and that actually fits very well with the wider research because around the same time, in the 70s, we were getting a lot of encounters, not just in Iowa, but we were getting them around the Midwest. Go further south, you get Momo, described almost very similar in its first encounter to the Ottosen creature, where it was seen carrying off a dead dog. And then you go even further south to southern Illinois, where you get the Big Muddy Monster. That was a very popular sighting back in '73. And then go further south, you get the Fouke Monster. So also, it fits well with our own research because you spent time up in Saskatchewan, Canada.
Yeah, so even up north, if you guys haven't been to Saskatchewan, it is very much like Iowa. It is a farming province where you wouldn't typically think a Sasquatch would live. But there is still sightings, and usually they're seasonal. So again, we think it's along a migratory path.
Yeah, it seems like they really love using agricultural hubs that we create and use it as their own cover. Also built-in food source, so.
Exactly. So I mean, did we crack the case? It was a Bigfoot. Is there any other explanation as to what happened in this town?
Nope. At least that's where a lot of the Bigfoot cultists want us to leave it. Well, there was still weirder details in it, though, that made me give a little bit of thought to other stuff, maybe some weirder aspects of this that kind of stuck out to me earlier this year when I was delving into the collective works of John Keel. Anyone know who John Keel is? All right, well, do you know what the Mothman Prophecies is? He's the guy who penned the Mothman Prophecies, and he often got into some of the weirder side of monster sightings. He wrote a lot about how oftentimes monsters were seen with luminous eyes, not reflective eyes that created their own light. And oftentimes with monster sightings, weirder ghost-like activity would happen. Sometimes people would hear disembodied voices. In the Mothman case in particular, he heard a lot of cases where they heard voices asking, "What is your time cycle?"
That sounds awfully familiar to parts of this Ottosen case. People were describing the creature having dazzling or burning eyes. And then that first sighting, they hear this voice out of nowhere asking what time it is.
Yeah, sounds like there is a little bit more at play than just an average Bigfoot sighting. Along with that, Keel said in places where there is hotspots of monster sightings, you'll often find the other phenomena not far behind. And
So, does Ottosen actually have strangeness happening around it as well?
oh, I'm glad you asked. Not only was there the Bigfoot sightings in Ottosen, a lot of stuff we find in Humboldt County let's go back to West Bend. When we were touring with the groundskeeper, he was telling us all sorts of ghost phenomena that was happening at the grotto. We go further out, we get a lot of cases of UFOs buzzing over Humboldt. There's one case in particular that was almost ripped straight out of Mothman Prophecies. It is an insane, all-consuming case that we might do a lecture on someday. It's insane.
Yep.
Let's go further out. Brad Steiger, who could almost be considered the John Keel of Iowa, he wrote a lot of paranormal related books. When he was a boy out in his farm outside of Bode, he saw this diminutive, almost extraterrestrial like creature he described having a big bald head, big reptilian eyes, and pointed ears, which almost fit the bill of the Hopkinsville goblins that would be seen almost 10 to 20 years later. So, another also interesting detail that Keel went into as a symptom of high strangeness is synchronicity. Where did a lot of the modern Bigfoot sightings kick off in California?
Well, that was also a Humboldt County.
Yeah, kind of weird. Might be just a coincidence. I like to think it was synchronicity. But once we took away the more realistic, it wasn't a displaced animal, I'm pretty confident in saying it wasn't a hoax. Once you take away those and you're left with this fork in the road of, was it a Bigfoot? Was it just a high strangeness case? That was just why I felt the story was compelling and wanted to talk more about it. It just read like a spin-off of Jaws or something, with the sheriff taking on this creature, the experts coming in.
Trying to help the sheriff solve the case.
Yeah, it was larger than life. And so I just knew this was a story that we had to tell. And we're actually going to tell it in comic book form. I have some promos out at our booth called Sasquatch of the Corn. This will be told in comic book form. I have the first 6 pages compiled. I'm going to be doing more. So you can follow along with that on social medias. On that note, we are on Anomalous Midwest across Instagram, TikTok, and BlueSky. So you can follow more of our capers into the high strangeness along there. All right.
Well,
Stick
thank you
around
so
for
much.
Frogman next up.
Yeah.